Exactly $20 billion evaporated from Bill Hwang's personal accounts in only 48 hours. One man's private fortune dwarfed the entire gross domestic product of Iceland. But here's what they don't tell you about the hidden swaps masking his risk. Archegos Capital Management functioned as a financial ghost ship capable of sinking global investment banks. This March 2021 disaster remains the fastest destruction of individual wealth in human history. At its peak, the Archegos portfolio was estimated to be worth a staggering $100 billion. Yet this entire empire was built on a fragile foundation of approximately $10 billion to $20 billion in actual equity. This is a leverage ratio of 5 to 1 or higher, meaning for every dollar Hwang actually owned, he was betting $5 of the bank's money. To put that in perspective, it's like buying $1 million home with almost no down payment, while the market is already starting to shake. When the volatility hit, the result wasn't just a loss. It was a total liquidation that sent shockwaves through the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, and every major This invisible fragility remains a significant threat to your financial security today because, as we are about to see, the safeguards we trust to prevent a repeat of the 2008 crisis were effectively bypassed by a single, determined investor using tools that even the regulators didn't realize were being exploited on such a massive scale. The collapse of Archegos wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of a high-stakes game played in the shadows of the global financial system. To understand how one man could lose $20 billion of his personal fortune in just 48 hours, we have to examine the ghost in the machine. The structural shadows where Bill Hwang built his invisible empire. Born Sung Kook Hwang, he was a prominent member of the elite Tiger Cubs, a fraternity of high-stakes hedge fund managers mentored by the legendary Julian Robertson at Tiger Management. In this hyper-competitive environment, high conviction and aggressive bets were not just encouraged, they were the foundational standard for success. However, in 2012, Hwang's professional career faced a seemingly fatal blow when his firm, Tiger Asia Management, pleaded guilty to wire fraud involving This misconduct led to a $44 million settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission and effectively barred him from managing outside capital. But rather than retiring into anonymity, Hwang performed a brilliant financial vanishing act. In 2013, he converted his remaining personal wealth into a private family office named Archegos, a Greek term meaning one who leads the way, or prince. Under the post-2008 Dodd-Frank Act, family offices are treated with a remarkably light regulatory touch, exempt from the grueling transparency and registration rules that govern traditional hedge funds. This provided the first layer of Hwang's invisibility. The second layer was his strategic use of a complex derivative known as the total return swap. Think of a swap as a synthetic trade that functions like a shadow account. Instead of buying a stock directly in the open market, Hwang entered into private contracts with global prime brokers such as Credit Suisse, Nomura, and Morgan Stanley. The banks would purchase the actual shares on their own balance sheets, while Hwang would simply receive the profits or pay the losses of the stock's performance. Because the banks remained the technical owners of record, Hwang was able to bypass the mandatory 5% ownership disclosure rule known as Schedule 13D. By repeating this specific process with multiple banks simultaneously, he built a massive, hyper-concentrated empire worth nearly $100 billion at its peak without the public ever knowing he existed. He operated with a leverage ratio of 5 to 1, meaning for every dollar of equity he actually owned, he was borrowing $4 of debt from the banks. This allowed an individual who was technically barred from the industry to become one of the most powerful and yet entirely invisible forces in the global financial markets, hidden behind the very institutions designed to manage risk. To understand how $20 billion of personal wealth evaporates in 48 hours, we have to look under the hood of the most dangerous engine in modern finance, the total return swap. Imagine you want to buy a $1 million apartment, but you only have $200,000 in the bank. In the physical world, you take out a mortgage. In Bill Hwang's world, you go to a global investment bank like Credit Suisse or Nomura and propose a deal. You tell them, you buy the apartment, keep it in your name on your balance sheet. I will pay you a steady fee. And in exchange, if the value of that apartment goes up, you pay me the profit. However, if the value drops, I must pay you the difference immediately. This is the essence of a total return swap, or TRS. It is a derivative contract that allowed Archegos to control a massive $100 billion portfolio using only $20 billion of actual equity. This created a 5-to-1 leverage ratio, meaning every 1% move in the market was magnified 5 times over. If his stocks went up 10%, Hwang doubled his money. If they dropped 20%, he was wiped out completely. But Hwang wasn't just using leverage, he was using concentration. Most institutional investors diversify to protect themselves, but the Archegos empire was built on a handful of specific pillars, most notably Viacom CBS and Discovery Inc. To maintain this empire, Hwang was accused of a tactic called banging the close, executing massive trades right at the end of the trading day to artificially inflate stock prices. This created a toxic feedback loop. As stock prices rose, the value of Hwang's collateral increased, allowing him to borrow even more money from the banks to buy even more stock, pushing the price higher once again. The most terrifying part of this mechanism was the swap loophole. Because Archegos was a private family office using derivatives rather than direct stock ownership, they didn't have to file a schedule. This meant Archegos could own more than 10% of a company without the public or other banks ever knowing. Goldman Sachs had no idea that Morgan Stanley and Nomura were lending Hwang billions of dollars against the exact same stocks. It was a house of cards built in a hall of mirrors. Why did the world's most sophisticated banks, with all their risk models and post-2008? The answer is yield chasing. In a decade of record-low interest rates following the Great Recession, global banks were desperate for the massive trading fees a whale like Hwang generated. They ignored the lessons of the 2008 crisis and even disregarded Hwang's 2012 wire fraud conviction because the short-term profits were too intoxicating to refuse. The music finally stopped on March 22, 2021, when Viacom CBS announced a $3 billion secondary stock offering. By flooding the market with new shares, the price naturally began to slide. For a standard investor, a 9% drop is a bad day at the office. For Archegos, trapped in a high-leverage one-way trade, that drop was a cataclysm. It triggered the dreaded margin call. The moment the banks stopped being partners and started being debt collectors, demanding billions in cash that Bill Hwang simply did not have. The chaos truly ignited on March 22, 2021. It started with a seemingly routine announcement. Viacom CBS, one of the largest holdings in Bill Hwang's concentrated portfolio, planned a $3 billion secondary stock offering. To an average investor, this might seem like a minor administrative move, but in the high-stakes world of leveraged derivatives, it was the first domino. The market reacted poorly, and the stock price began to slide. For Archegos, this was a mathematical catastrophe. Because Hwang was using 5-to-1 leverage through total return swaps, contracts where banks like Credit Suisse and Nomura held the actual shares while Hwang collected the gains, or paid the losses, a 10% drop in the stock price effectively wiped out 50% of his underlying equity. By March 23rd and 24th, the phones at the Archegos headquarters began to ring incessantly. These were margin calls. In simple terms, a margin call is the lender's way of saying, "The collateral you gave us is no longer enough to cover the risk of your loan. Give us more cash immediately, or we will seize and sell your assets." Archegos, despite overseeing a portfolio that had recently touched $100 billion, was forced to admit the unthinkable. They did not have the liquidity to meet the calls. Everything they believed up to this point was wrong. On the evening of March 25th, a desperate digital summit took place between Archegos and its prime brokers, including Thomas Gottstein's Credit Suisse, Nomura, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley. Hwang's team proposed a standstill agreement, an orderly liquidation where every bank would sell their shares slowly. It was a classic example of the prisoner's dilemma from game theory. If all the banks stood together, they might minimize the damage. But if one bank defected and sold first, they would capture the highest remaining price while leaving the others to suffer the inevitable price collapse. By the morning of Friday, March 26th, the tiger cub culture of aggressive self-interest won out. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley broke ranks, executing massive fire sales of Archegos-related blocks totaling nearly $20 billion. As these billions of dollars in stock hit the market all at once, prices for companies like Discovery and Baidu went into a free fall, dropping as much as 30% in a single session. For those who waited, the result was a bloodbath. Credit Suisse, which was slower to act than its American rivals, eventually reported a stagger. In a frantic 48-hour window, the lack of coordination and the sheer scale of the one-way trades turned a private family office's bad week into a $10 billion hole in the global financial system. The fallout of this $20 billion vanishing act didn't end with a zeroed-out balance sheet. It ended with a prison sentence on July 10, 2024. Bill Hwang was convicted on 10 of 11 criminal counts, including wire fraud, securities fraud, and racketeering. To understand the gravity of that last charge, you have to look at the law. Racketeering is typically a tool used to take down organized crime syndicates like the mafia. By applying it here, federal prosecutors sent a clear message that the way Archegos operated was not just aggressive investing, it was a criminal conspiracy. It set a massive legal precedent for what we call open market manipulation. It proved that even if you are just buying and selling stocks on a public exchange, you are committing a crime if your intent is to create a smoke and mirrors environment that tricks other investors into thinking a stock is more valuable than it actually is. But the most visible victim of the Archegos collapse wasn't a person. It was The $5.5 billion loss suffered by Credit Suisse was the wound from which the bank never recovered. Combined with other risk management failures, like the Greensill Capital scandal, the Archegos disaster shattered the bank's reputation and capital reserves, leading directly to its historic collapse and forced acquisition by UBS in 2023. This is what economists call a contagion effect, when the reckless behavior of one hidden player creates a localized financial crisis that eventually burns down the neighborhood. For the average investor, this serves as a grim reminder that even the most prestigious global banks are often just a few bad trades away from insolvency. Regulators are now rushing to close the doors that Hwang walked through. The SEC has proposed Rule 10b-1, a new regulation designed to force large investors to pull back the curtain on their total return swaps. This would effectively end the family office loophole that allowed Archegos to move $100 billion in the shadows without ever filing a public report. These moves are designed to stop what I call the invisible tax of market manipulation. When a whale like Hwang bangs the close, executing massive trades in the final minutes of the day to artificially pump a stock price, everyone else pays. If your 401k or your favorite index fund rebalanced during those moments, you likely bought those shares at an inflated price. It is a hidden drain on your wealth that you never see on your monthly statement. But it keeps you from reaching your retirement goals just as surely as high inflation or high fees. So, how do you protect your financial future? Your first line of defense is recognizing that concentration is the ultimate risk. While Hwang built a throne out of just a few stocks like Viacom, CBS, and Discovery, a truly diversified portfolio is your insurance policy against the next Archegos. Today, your actionable step is to audit your own holdings. Don't just look at the names of your funds. Look at the top 10 holdings list. If you find that the same 5 or 6 massive tech companies make up 40% of your supposedly safe index fund, you aren't as diversified as you think. You are participating in a concentrated trade, and as we saw with Bill Hwang, when the momentum shifts, the exit door is never wide enough for everyone. Audit your concentration today, ensure your risk is spread across different sectors, and hit the subscribe button to join this community of financially literate investors. The best way to protect your money is to understand the hidden gears that move it.